Chapter 1 of Potemkin Village. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. Potemkin Village by Fletcher Pratt. Chapter 1. Director Unterbaum of the Intercolonial Office rose from his chair as the pair came in. "I take it you haven't met before," he said. "Mr. and Mrs. Lanzarote, this is Anne Starnes, the recording photographer, and Robert Heidkopfer, one of our better writers." There were smiles and acknowledgments. Unterbaum touched a pair of buttons on his desk, and 2 chairs slid out of the walls to make a group of 5. "Sit down, please," he said. "Now, I'm not going to mince words. The reason you're here is because the council wants you, 3 of you at least, to undertake a mission. Vincent," he indicated Lanzarote, who nodded a dark head, "already knows something about it, but for the benefit of Miss Starnes and Mr. Heidkopfer, I will say that we want to send you to Tolstoia." Heidkopfer smiled and said, "Sounds better than that trip to the polar mines on Mars, eh, Anne?" "Warmer anyhow," said the girl, turning a carefully kept blonde head. "But I thought Tolstoia was closed to visitors." "The patriarch has agreed to let a delegation in for this visit," said Unterbaum, "so we can render a fair and unbiased report on Tolstoia. In word, picture, and observation. The point is this: there are some islands about 300 miles off the coast of Tolstoia, between it and South Burgenland, the Rightly Islands. They have no resources, but Tolstoia wants to colonize them." He touched buttons again, and a map appeared on the wall showing the almost round shape of the island nation, with the islands and the tip of South Burgenland at the right. Unterbaum went on. "They're uninhabited, so there isn't any objection from the Demographic Commission, although it's unusual for one of the hermit states to expand. But there are certain features of the request that make the council inclined to go slow, or at least to want more information." He stopped, seeming to wait for a question, so Heidkopfer asked it. "What are they?" Lanzarote answered. "To begin with, the place was founded in accordance with the philosophy of Count Leo Tolstoi, a Russian writer of some centuries back. The Russians discovered that a sect of people who believed in his ideas was growing up in their country and considered it a threat to the organization of their state. They couldn't dispose of the Tolstoians under the genocide laws, so they appealed to the council, and it agreed to expatriate all the Tolstoians the Russians could identify." "Then it was a penal colony, like the moon mines?" inquired Heidkopfer. "No," said Lanzarote. "As a matter of fact, when the announcement was made, the Tolstoians came forward in numbers and identified themselves. But they thought they were going to have a reservation set apart for them in Russia itself, and when they found they were going to an island on Venus, there was a certain amount of resentment." "Do you think it still exists? That if they're allowed to get hold of the islands, they'll do something drastic? Say, start a war?" "Not after all these years," said Lanzarote. "It's nearly 3 centuries, and national resentments don't last that long without something to feed on. Besides, pacifism was one of Tolstoi's doctrines." "Then what are we supposed to look for?" Lanzarote spread his hands. "We don't know. That's what's worrying the diplomatic division. Asking for more territory indicates a rising birth rate, but the kind of territory they're asking for doesn't promise a rise serious enough to worry the Demographic Commission. We don't consider it likely that Tolstoianism has become militant, but to be honest, we just don't know." Anne Starnes smiled. "It sounds like hunting for a needle in a haystack when you don't even know whether there's any needle," she said. "On the contrary," said Unterbaum, "we're fairly certain there is a needle, and a sharp one. What we need to know is what kind of needle it is before someone gets stuck with it. Listen." He snapped up one of the lids in his desk and spun a wheel of recording tape. "Planes aren't allowed to land in Tolstoia, of course, but every once in a while one comes down there, and occasionally a yacht or fishing craft gets wrecked on the coast. Now, the normal procedure in such a case with a hermit state is that they hold survivors and notify someone to come and get them. They stopped doing that about 80 years ago. "What do you mean?" said Heidkopfer. "Stopped notifying or stopped rescuing survivors?" "It isn't quite certain," said Unterbaum, "but here's the sequence such as it is. 78 years ago, Bernard Jones and his wife disappeared while on a flight from McNider to South Burgenland." He indicated the map. "You see, that would carry them close to Tolstoia. 3 months later, one of the fishing vessels, which are the only form of communication the Tolstoians have, turned up at McNider. It had a letter from Mrs. Jones. She said her husband had died in a crash landing and she was staying in Tolstoia with the permission of the authorities." "Anything wrong about that?" asked Heidkopfer. "There's nothing wrong with any of this," said Unterbaum, "at least as far as that instance goes. It's other things. Nothing has been heard of Mrs. Jones since. 76 years ago, a musician named Bruno Zaleski went on a yachting trip in the South Ocean with a party of 3. They never came back. After the usual interval, letters came through from all of them. They said they found Tolstoia a Venusian paradise and were going to stay. Zaleski was heard from again. At the time of the next incident, 1 year later, his brother received a letter telling how happy he was. He paused for a moment. The incident 67 years ago was the beginning of a new series. It concerned a man named Walter Artem, another plain case. Like Jones, he disappeared. One of the Tolstoian fishing crafts brought him back, but he was dead. They had preserved his body carefully. I'll show you the picture. He touched the stud, and the watchers found themselves gazing at a coffin, partly glassed, so the occupant was visible to the waist. Rose Lanzarote gave a little cry, and with reason, for the face within was peculiarly horrible, bloated and suffused with blood, the neck swelling out over a clearly visible rope. They explained he had hanged himself, Unterbaum continued. I have a question, said Anne Starnes. Why did they go to all the trouble of preserving him just the way he died? It sounds as though they were afraid somebody might get suspicious. That's what I thought, said Unterbaum, but there's an explanation. The records show that the Tolstoians, even while they were in Russia, showed a peculiar reverence for their dead when they were important people. It's a holdover from their 20th century leader Lenin. They preserve bodies this way so they're visible. The explanation that came with Artem's body was that the Tolstoians didn't know how important he was, but thought he might be big enough to deserve preservative treatment. Polite of them, murmured Lanzarote. Very, said Unterbaum, almost too polite, because it was repeated since Artem there have been 6 cases of castaways on Tolstoia committing suicide and being delivered at MacNider in preserved form. All hangings? Asked Heidekopfer. No, 1 stabbing, 3 shootings, 2 overdoses of soporifics. There are autopsy records on these, and they're legitimate. Seems a high proportion of suicides among the castaways, said Heidekopfer. Can anything be made of that? Nobody seems to think so, said Unterbaum. 7 suicides out of a given group over a period of 80 years isn't much after all. The thing that stirred up our office was the discovery that in the past 80 years, not 1 castaway has come back alive, and they've either been crated out as suicides or sent through letters saying they have decided to become citizens of Tolstoia. He paused a moment to let that sink in. A number of these cases are rather special. There was Carmenella Bayo, 44 years ago. She was a video dancer on a flight from MacNider to South Bergenland, sent out the usual letter saying she had decided her future lay in Tolstoia, and followed it with another one a couple of years later. That's ordinary enough, but the case made the news, and when we went through the records, we found that when she disappeared, she had been married only 3 months and was passionately devoted to her husband. Her second letter was written in a kind of code and asked him to fake an accident and join her there. Did he? Asked Anne Starnes. Any possibility of forgery in those letters? Asked Heidekopfer at the same time. Unterbaum turned to the girl. No to your question. As for the other one, Carmenella Bayo's private code was certainly no forgery. Heidekopfer said, it appeared that the Tolstoians compel them to stay there, and if they argue, bump them off. Is that it? That would be a charge of genocide. I do not think, began Lanzarote. I don't either, said Unterbaum. The Tolstoians wouldn't expose themselves to such a thing, especially in view of their origins. No, I'm convinced they have been quite honest, leaning over backward as witness the preserved suicides, but there's some factor in the equation we don't know, and I won't deny that there's danger in the trip. Then I'm going, said Rosa Lanzarote decisively. She was a small woman with vivid Italiote coloring. Anne Starnes said, might as well square the party off, hadn't we? It would be nice to have someone to handle the recording tapes and films. Unterbaum frowned. The Intercolonial Office, he began. Lanzarote said, I believe that psychologists recognize it as temperamental danger to send 2 men and 1 woman on a protracted expedition. I ought to know better than to argue with a diplomat, said Unterbaum. End of Chapter 1.
Chapter 2 of Potemkin Village. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Rohit Gokhale. Potemkin Village by Fletcher Pratt. Chapter 2. The low spit guarding the harbour entrance was only a slightly deeper blue than the water and perpetual overcast of Venus. Captain Ratterman sighed, reported No charts, and spoke into the communicator. Cut speed to 8 knots, use full automatics on the bottom sonics. Then he turned to the pair beside him on the bridge. I am not being inhospitable. In fact, you're welcome to stay as long as you please. But it's fair to warn you that we won't be docking for another 3 hours. We love your company, said Anstans. But Heidekopfer picked at her arm and led her toward the gangway. When they had reached the low, flat bow, with the water whispering softly beneath, he said, How about it, Anne? Why not marry me now and save trouble? You are going to anyway someday, and it might be a protection here. She put a hand over one of his. No, Bob, not now. I'll give you first place on the list, but I'm not going to marry you or anybody else until I'm something more than a failure. You were no failure. The fact that you were selected for this job proves it. Just a competent mechanical photographer, Bob. You needn't tell me. I was picked because I had worked with you before, and your work is important. Look, he started to say, then let it trail off. They had argued the point so often it was like another trip on a merry-go-round. Anne said, I don't want to be just a wife like Rosa Lanzarote. He moved. Do you think she's a failure? No, not within her own dimension. It just isn't mine. I want to be something more important than a good mechanical photographer. Did it ever occur to you, he began, and let it trail off as he watched the formation of the odd Venusian batfish soar from the water under the bow and sweep over it to dive again in perfect alignment. The ship swung. The long blue tongue of land came round on their right and the harbour opened before them. There was a little grove of masts at its depth clustered around what seemed to be docks, but he saw no town on the shore behind. Think you can handle the language all right now? Asked Anne, a note of banter in her question. If there hasn't been too much development in it since Tolstoia was closed off, communications thought a good many special terms might have developed. What worries me more is the system of ideas. You were lucky, not having to study Tolstoy. He had a philosophy all right, but I can't conceive how it could be translated into a practical method of living, and neither can Vincent. Unless we do understand, it's going to be hard to present a sympathetic picture. Photos are always sympathetic, said Anne. The question is, do we want to be? Let's go down and have a cup of coffee. The betting is there won't be any where we are going. The other two were in the cabin, and the cup of coffee lasted until a cessation of movement and a slight bump indicated they had arrived. There was a bustle of gathering luggage. They went topside to find the gangplank already laid to a dilapidated dock with holes in the planking, alongside which little Tolstoian fishing craft rose and fell rhythmically to the swell. At the shore end of the dock, a little group of men in embroidered white smocks with square caps on their heads looked on with an air of complete uninterest as the ambassadors disembarked. There were 4 droshkis behind them. A house was visible among drooping branched Venusian trees. Anne set her camera to automatic and hooked it to her belt as Lanzarote led the way along the dock. 3 of the men detached themselves from the group and waited. As the ambassadors approached, one of them clasped his hands together, said, Beman, Andrei Pavlich, and took a step back. Vikranov, Nikolai Leonovich, said the second, and the third, Kazetsky Pyotr Ilyich. He was a tall man, with a long hooked nose and an expression of deep melancholy. Lanzarote stepped forward. We are the representatives of the Interplanetary Council, he said. My name is Vincent Lanzarote with the rank of ambassador. This is Mrs. Lanzarote and Miss Starnes, a photographer, and Mr. Heidekopfer, the official observer. We have a good deal of baggage. The 3 looked at each other. Behrman was a short man with a broad Slavic face. He said, Bring it forward. Transportation has been provided to the seat of the patriarch. Heidekopfer remembered that somewhere in Tolstoi there was something about not waiting on other people. Also, that he was not going to have as much difficulty with the language as he had feared. Behrman's accent was a little funny, but he put his sentences together in the classical manner and with the right words. The sailors were loading their baggage onto power dollies. Vikranov said, "The ambassador will take the first droshky with myself and Pyotr Ilyich. Andrei Pavlich will accompany you in the second." He waved a hand toward Anne and Heidekopfer. As their guides led the way toward the vehicles, Heidekopfer said, "One thing surprises me, if you don't mind a snap judgment. I would have expected to find more of a city around your port." Behrman turned his head with a smile. "We have no cities," he said. "They are destroyers of nature, and without communion with nature there is no happiness." That was good Tolstoy, all right, thought Heidekopfer, and said to Anne, "They don't take very good care of their roads here, do they?" "I should say not. And my mud cheddars are all nicely packed in the baggage too." She lifted a neatly clad foot that was already plentifully marked with black Venusian mire. "Their trees are nice, though, and look how even the rows in that field are." She aimed the camera at it for a moment and spoke to Behrman in Russian. "Where are the fishermen for the boats?" "Oh, this is Thursday," he said, standing aside so she could get in the droshky. "On this day, they work in the fields. It is good to work in the fields, and we have a law that all who follow other forms of work shall do so for 1 day a week." "That's not a bad law for an agricultural community," observed Heidekopfer. "I suppose you're practically all agriculture? But what do you do for manufactured articles, like shoes and glass and newspapers?" In the droshka ahead, Vikranov raised his hand. Both drivers shouted something like "Yeah, yeah" simultaneously, cracked their whips tremendously, and the procession was off along a dirt road in a decidedly poor state of repair. "I'm not sure I understand your question," said Behrman. "Shoes or glass, when we want them, we make them. As for newspapers, they are forbidden by the word of the master. I know there must be such things because they are mentioned, but I have never seen one and do not really know what they are." The road had begun to rise toward a cut in a range of low hills. "Uh-huh," said Heidekopfer. "And I suppose radio falls under the prohibition on newspapers. Well, let me put it this way. Suppose someone had an idea for a new kind of machine. Would he have to make all the parts himself? There is a law against machines. They interfere with simplicity. But doesn't anyone ever have an idea for a machine so brilliant that he simply has to make it in spite of the law? How could he? It is against the law." "Do you mean that the law here is always obeyed?" "Always. That is the superiority of Tolstoia to all other peoples. Those who come to our happy country by accident never wish to leave when they find that through the doctrines of the master we have established the brotherhood of men." Anne gave a little giggle. "I know," said Heidekopfer rapidly in English. "I think we can take that with a cellar full of salt." He switched to Russian. "Then you have no crime?" "In our happy country?" said Behrman. "No. Look how beautiful is the arrangement of the cows in that field." Heidekopfer sighed. Then he said, "Tell me something about the government of your country. I don't want to be too inquisitive, but I have to report on these things when I get back." Behrman's face flashed a frown. "It is hard to explain this to an outsider. But we know of what you call government only from the works of the master, who spoke of it as it was in the old days, in the old Russia, the holy Russia." He lifted a hand to his face, and Heidekopfer was dumbfounded to see the man was wiping away a tear. "There is the patriarch, but he is only the general secretary of the Supreme Soviet." "Well, who makes the laws?" "The Supreme Soviet." "How are they elected or chosen?" "We all agree on them." Hyderkopfer was saved from going mad by a cry from Anstans. They had passed through the cut into the hills, and now, as they swung round the brow of one, a wide valley lay spread before them under the soft Venusian light. It was dotted with little clumps of trees and had houses here and there, mostly low and with curiously bound down thatched roofs. With the green fields and grazing animals, it made a scene of truly pastoral beauty. Anne said, "Tell him to stop for a minute, will you? I want to get this." Behrman looked at Hyderkopfer. "Is it your will also that we stop?" "Sure, why not?" said he. "Isn't even necessary to ask if the girlfriend wants it. Do you have a law about women getting permission for what they want to do too?" "No." "Stop, Pavel Josephowitch." He turned to Hyderkopfer. "But the will of one must become the will of all." "Now I don't understand," said Hyderkopfer, as Anne adjusted her camera to take a sweeping panorama of the valley. "Would you mind explaining?" In happy Tolstoia, when the desire of one person would cause others to do what they might not desire, all must agree before it is done. To allow anything else would be compulsion, and as the master says, anything that savors of compulsion is harmful. "I can see where there must be some prize family arguments in happy Tolstoia," said Anne in English. "Would I like to be married to a man if I had to get his agreement every time I wanted to buy a new hat? No." "If you'll marry me, you won't have to," began Hyderkopfer, but Behrman was speaking again. "It was not always so. When our people came from Holy Russia, they were like others on earth, with only the desire for universal brotherhood and the writings of the Master to guide them. But there was so much love among them, and they obeyed the law so well, that 131 of our years ago, brotherhood was attained, and the will of all became the will of the one. Now it is possible for us to extend the privilege of agreement to outsiders. This is why none who have felt it wish to leave." By this time, they had almost caught up to the leading droshke, which was just turning into a tree-lined alley at the end of which stood quite the largest house they had yet seen. It had 2 stories and a couple of jutting wings beside the central door. "This where we are going?" asked Anne. "The residence of the patriarch Pitrim Androvich Samsonov," said Behrman, with the sonorous accents of one who is aware of saying something impressive. The others got out and waited for them. When they had assembled, Vikranov led the procession, opening the door himself, and they found themselves in a neat hall with whitewashed walls and plain chairs standing against them. The light from the door was helped out by a couple of candles in bracket holders on the wall. Vikranov said, "You will wait here," and turned through a door to the right. It could not have been more than a couple of minutes before a tall, strong man came out, wiping his hands on his smock, as though he had just been interrupted in something. Hyderkopfer experienced an almost physical shock at the emanation of personality that seemed to flow from him. He might equally have been a general or a prophet, but either way there was no doubting that if he wanted somebody to do something, they would probably do it. Anne too was affected. She lifted her camera and let the photographing light play on the patriarch. But he moved his head slightly. The light went out, and she put the camera back to her belt, an expression of awe suffusing her face. Vikranov said, "Little father, these are the ambassadors from the council. They did not tell me their names." Lanzarote gave him a peculiar look and said, "I am the ambassador, and my name is Lanzarote. This is—" The big man lifted a hand. "It is good for simplicity to address all persons by their patronymics," he said. "Mine is Pitrim Androvich." Instead of looking at Lanzarote, he was staring fixedly at Anne. "Oh, I see," said the diplomat. "Well, by that system, I suppose you'd have to call me Vincent Guidovich. And this is my wife, Rosa, Mariovna." Hyderkopfer and Anne similarly identified themselves. Samsonov said, We will show you to your rooms. Is it your custom to change the clothes after traveling? Rosa Lanzarote spoke for the group. I think I'd like to change my shoes at least. They got rather muddy. Samsonov turned to Kazetsky. Pyotr Ilyich, will you and the horse drivers bring the baggage of the ambassadors to the rooms in the West Wing in the name of the master? There is a special law that this service may be performed for them. He reached out a hand, calmly took one of Anne's, and began to lead her along the hall toward a door on the opposite side. There didn't seem to be anything to do but follow. Do you have any children? Said Samsonov, as he turned down a corridor at right angles to the first. It is nature's way of life for women to have children. Anne laughed. I'm afraid not yet. I'm going to leave that until after I'm married. It is not against our law for women to have children before. Still holding the girl's hand, he touched a door. This room will belong to you, Vincent Guidovich. The next was for Heiderkopfer. The open door showed a clean, plain room with Venetian yellow poppies in a vase on a writing table, a bed, and a washstand with a pitcher of water. The walls were bare, and there didn't seem to be any plumbing. Outside, the baggage was arriving. Heiderkopfer claimed his own, unpacked, and put on a pair of clean shoes, and went out to find Anne's door open and the girl engaged in a similar task. He grumbled, If that big bruiser keeps on making such a play for you, it's going to be bad for international relations. She laughed. He said he loved me, but in the brotherhood of man, everyone must love everyone else. Then he let me take his picture. Let's go check with the Lanzarotes before going to the audience. She stood up. End of chapter 2. Chapter 3 of Potemkin Village. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Rohit Gokhale. Potemkin Village by Fletcher Pratt. Chapter 3. Lanzarote was zipping open a bottle container. Well, Robert Marejovich, first impressions. About what I would have expected from a regime founded on the ideas of Tolstoi, said Heiderkopfer, and a rather screwy setup. But my general impression was not unfavorable. They seem to be running the place with a decent respect for human values and each other. The will of all is the will of one, quoted Lanzarote. Did they say that to you too? He took a couple of bottles of champagne from the container. I'm going to give our hosts a treat. It never hurts in opening diplomatic negotiations. I suppose it's too early to ask yet, but you didn't run onto anything that might be a clue to why we aren't getting the castaways back? Nothing that you would call a clue, but something that might have a connection. Our guide told us that Tolstoia had attained the brotherhood of man 131 Venus years ago. That's 81 Earth years, and strikes awful close to the date when Unterbaum said the disappearances began. Even so, said Anne, I can't see a whole group of people who have been brought up in civilization giving it up for this. She swept her hand around the room, which was as bare as the others, especially that dancer he mentioned. A point, conceded Lanzarote. Shall we go? He led the way back to the main hall. The door from which Samsonov had emerged stood open, and there was a wide table in the room beyond, laid with an array of dishes which held any number of hors d'oeuvres, while 8 or 9 men and women were gathered around Samsonov. You know your Russian customs all right, Heiderkopfer murmured to Lanzarote as the patriarch came forward. He explained that these were the Central Committee of the Supreme Soviet. There were introductions, and Lanzarote presented his champagne, which Heiderkopfer had to open because none of the Tolstoians seemed to know how. Vikranov said admiringly, How beautiful is the play of bubbles in this beverage, as the ambassador lifted his glass, saying, to the future of Tolstoia, bowed to Samsonov, and drank. The patriarch's return bow was a trifle stiff, but he sipped and immediately appeared to become the victim of a revolution, spitting the champagne on the floor and coughing with bulging eyes, while the others gathered round him with expressions of sympathy. After a moment of gasping recovery, he pushed them aside and said to Lanzarote, "I taste alcohol. Is it not so?" "To be sure," said the ambassador. "You can't very well make champagne without it. Please accept my sincerest apologies for offering it to you if it offends you, however. We have a law against it in Tolstoia. The drinking of alcohol leads to failure to recognize the brotherhood of man." Hydrokopfer said to Anne, "They had a law against alcohol in America once too, but as far as I can remember, it didn't keep people from drinking." "Hush," she said. "I like to watch the way he holds his head." Her eyes were fixed on Samsonov, who was returning the glance with interest as he talked to the ambassador. Hydrokopfer growled, helped himself to some of the zakushi, which seemed to consist largely of various kinds of pickled fish and vegetables with some of the soft Venetian cara nuts, and moved over to join the group around Rosa Lanzarote. Kazetsky was just saying, "It would pleasure me greatly, little mother, if it is your will to allow me to show you some of the natural beauty of happy Tolstoia tomorrow, while the others are making their official observations." "Thank you," she said, "but I usually go with my husband on inspection trips, when there are any, and I think I'd rather like to—" She broke off suddenly with a frown between her brows, and Hydrokopfer noticed that the others in the group were staring at her with a quite peculiar intensity. Kazetsky was swinging in his fingers some kind of little bright ornament that he wore on a chain around his neck. Rosa Lanzarote said slowly, "I think it would be very nice. You'll have to call for me, though. I have no idea of what hours you keep in Tolstoia." Kazetsky's lugubrious countenance took on an expression that was almost a smile. "It shall be as you desire, little mother. The will of one is the will of all." The group seemed to split apart, and Vikranov's voice said in Hydrokopfer's ear, "Will you try some of our Tolstoyan beer, Robert Mareyovich?" "I thought you had a law against alcohol," said Hydrokopfer, accepting the proffered mug. "But beer is not alcohol. No one could become drunken from it. Besides, we have a law against becoming drunken too." "The hell you say," thought Hydrokopfer privately, and quaffed. It was about as he suspected. The beer was certainly not 3.2. He said, "What's the official schedule for us tomorrow?" "In the morning, we visit a school and see how children are educated in happy Tolstoia. If there is time, we will also visit the grave of the patriarch Ilarion Triumphowitch. In the afternoon, you will see one of our collective farms. On the following day, a picnic has been arranged. It will last all day in accordance with our custom." Hydrokopfer frowned. "The school may be some help, and I don't doubt that the farm will be. But in the nature of the report we have to make, a visit to one of your law courts would be a lot more interesting than a picnic, and a sitting of your Supreme Soviet more interesting still." Vikranov's flat face showed disapproval. "The sittings of the Supreme Soviet are in secret by law," he said. "We would have to pass a special law admitting you, and I am not sure, but it would be concessionary." "Excuse me, you seem to have developed a term there I have not heard before. What does concessionary mean?" The guy's disapproval surprisingly became sullenness. "Am I to blame if you cannot understand good Russian? We went to some trouble to learn it, even getting records of Russian as it was spoken at the time Tolstoia was founded, and I am sorry if I have given offense. But my friend, I'd have you remember that we are here to do you a favor, not the other way around. Have you got a dictionary?" "We have no need of dictionaries in happy Tolstoia. They are a part of culture, and culture is fatal to happiness. It is set down in the master's own words." It was saved from developing into a hassle as someone touched Heiderkopfer's arm to present him to Anna Golievna Samsonova, a small woman with dark hair, high cheekbones, and a mouth that seemed set in a perpetual mysterious smile. She said, "Have you been in Holy Russia on earth, Robert Mariovich?" "No, I haven't had that pleasure," he said, and added gallantly, "But I'm sure this is better. You have made life so much simpler." "Yes, that is true. Here in happy Tolstoia, the will of all is the will of one, and the will of all is toward the good of all. All are happy." Her eyes darted past him, and he half turned in time to see that Samsonov was certainly displaying indisputable signs of happiness as he talked to Anne. And what was a good deal worse, the girl was showing no signs of unhappiness. Rather hastily, he said, "Don't you ever have disagreements?" "Oh, yes, but they do not last long. And if one is not attuned, then he takes the cure." "I see," said Heiderkopfer, although he was reasonably sure he did not, and was saved from more of this disjointed conversation by the ringing of a bell, which Mrs. Samsonov said announced dinner. She led the way through the side door to another large room, where there was a table laid for dinner with steaming dishes already in place. Heiderkopfer noticed that the plates were of wood, and of the flatware beside them only the knife blades were metal. Everyone seemed to seat him or herself where they pleased, and fell to work at once on the food without ceremony. Mrs. Samsonov said, "You may find our food difficult. People who come here often do at first. But we have a law against eating meat except while taking the cure." Difficult was the word for it, reflected Heiderkopfer, munching away at something that appeared to be a combination of cabbage and boiled nuts with a sour sauce. He said, "You seem to have laws about almost everything. Clothes too?" She surveyed him with an air of puzzlement, and he noticed that in the candlelight her eyes had a singularly deep quality. "Of course. How would we know how to act without laws?" "Tell me, what does concessionary mean?" "It means—" She gave him that glance again. "I don't quite know how to define it, but something against the will of all. As you stay in happy Tolstoia, you will understand." For a moment, looking into her eyes, it seemed to Heiderkopfer that he almost did understand. Then she said, "Alexei Ivanovich is concessionary." "Who?" "Alexei Ivanovich Dubrasov, the traditionalist. He wished to become patriarch when Pyotr Androvich did, but he would have led Tolstoia back to the days before the Brotherhood of Man was achieved." She looked around the table and clapped her hands as a signal that the meal was over, and a couple of girls came hurrying in to gather the plates. Heiderkopfer said, "Pardon me, but didn't someone tell me that you had a law against serving one another?" "It is the will of all that the patriarch be served," she said. Nobody seemed to be leaving the table, and the reason became apparent when two men with goose-necked stringed instruments came in, accompanied by a girl who began to sing as they played. The music had certain haunting strains, but was so disjointed that Heiderkopfer decided he didn't like it, and looked down the table to see how the others were taking it. He got a shock. Samsonov, seated between Rosa Lanzarote and Anne, had his arm around the latter's shoulders, and she was leaning back with her eyes half closed and a smile of a smug kitten. End of chapter 3.
Chapter 4 of Potemkin Village. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by ShrimpPhish. Potemkin Village by Fletcher Pratt. Chapter 4. Anne's voice sounded vaguely apologetic as she explained to Heiderkopfer. "His wife didn't seem to mind," she said. I was watching her. That isn't the point, said Heidi Kopfer. It isn't even the point that I minded a hell of a lot. As you have so often informed me, I don't own you or even have a claim on you, much as I'd like to. I just want to know why you did it. The girl's lips closed and her pretty face set in obstinate lines. Because I wanted to. Because I felt like it. For the same reason I've kissed you a few times. But you've never kissed me with about 16 people looking on. And may I point out that the reason the castaways stayed in Tolstoia was because they wanted to, too. I want to know what made you want to do it. And you're going to put the whip on me to find out, said the girl, but with a smile. No use, Bob. Call it an uncontrollable impulse. Someone tapped at the door, and it was Lanzarote. Want to come into my room? He said. I'd like to compare notes, and if we do it here, 2 of us will have to sit on the bed. All right, said Heidi Kopfer. Rosa back yet? No, still communing with nature and Pyotr Ilyich Kazetsky. He glanced at his watch, saying, I forgot that's no good here on the different system of time, but I'd guess that it's a good hour before bedtime, so I'm not going to worry. Come on. He led the way down the hall and threw open the door. Notice that there isn't a lock in the place? Said Heidi Kopfer. It may really be true that they've abolished crime. I didn't see any either, said Lanzarote. But we have to be careful about drawing conclusions from guided tours. The Russians have always been great on setting up Potemkin villages. Oh, back in the old imperial days, an empress named Catherine went on a progress through the country to see how it was getting along under her prime minister, Potemkin. He went ahead of her and had villages set up, just the dummy fronts of houses, with actors to play the part of villagers. Back in the Soviet period, they used to pull the same trick, to show tourists how prosperous the country was, only they did it with real model villages and factories and people working in them. I don't think they're doing that with us, said Heidi Kopfer. On the way to the school, I asked to turn off and see one of the farms we passed, and it all seemed perfectly normal and in key with the rest. Shall I get the pictures? Said Anne. That white wall is rather rough, but I imagine it will take projection. No, they're for the record, said Lanzarote. I just want a verbal report and impressions. He stepped across the room and opened the sound box for recording. Well, said Heidi Kopfer, we went to a school this morning. It was quite small, but had children of all ages up to about 16. It was more like a manual training institute than what we'd call a school. Most of them were learning to use tools, and some of them working in a garden, and doing a pretty good job of it, I'd say. There was only one class with books. I asked about that, said Anne. They practically don't have any books, and those they do have are hand-set and hand-printed. Of course I can understand they're not using microfilm, said Heidi Kopfer. That would run into their prohibition of machines, but I don't quite see how they can claim a printing press isn't a machine. Lanzarote smiled. Logic isn't the long suit of most theorists, he said. However, my opinion is generally favorable. They seem to be decent people with a high standard of morality, and in spite of the Potemkin Village angle, it looks good. There's just one thing. We still haven't found any explanation of why the castaways didn't come back, and that is primarily why we came here. Heidi Kopfer said, We can add a second point to that now, or perhaps it's part of the same one. Did you notice Anne after dinner last night while the music was playing? Lanzarote said, I did notice that she seemed on fairly good terms with our host on somewhat short notice, but I assumed it was her own business. The trouble is that she can't tell why she did it, said Heidi Kopfer. A little spot of red appeared in the girl's cheeks. I told you because I felt like it, she said, and I'm not particularly grateful for being pumped about it. Excuse me, I've got to charge my camera while you discuss my case. She got up, avoided Heidi Kupfer's protesting hand, and slipped out the door. Lanzarote said, "The case seems to call for diplomacy, and as the diplomat of the expedition I prescribe a cooling-off period. Meanwhile continue." "There isn't much to continue with," said Heidi Kupfer, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. "You know as well as I do that her behavior with Samsonov wasn't, well, what you'd normally expect, even if it wasn't disgraceful or anything, but it seems to me that it's of a piece with the behavior of the castaways who decided to stay in Tolstoia. In both cases there was what she herself described as an uncontrollable impulse to do something not normally done." "Evidence of pattern," said Lanzarote. "You think pressure was applied from outside, but how? Was the food or the beer drugged? No, it couldn't have been that. We ate and drank the same things and weren't affected." "I don't know," said Heidi Kupfer. "It could have been a special for her. Samsonov hardly took his eyes off her from the first time he saw her." began Lanzarote, when a tap sounded on the door, and Rosa Lanzarote came into the room. "Hello, dear," she said. "Have a good day?" "Good, with a little mystery in it, which we were just discussing. And you?" She laughed. "The same. In fact, if you're up for a trip, the day isn't over yet." "What do you mean?" "There's a man outside with a droshky to take us to see someone who wants to meet you. I'll tell you the rest as we go. It might be a good idea if you come along too, Bob. Wait till I get a recorder." She went over to get one, of the small size that fits in a pocket, and the other two stood up. Heidi Kupfer stopped to tap at Anne's door, but she didn't answer. So he stopped at his own room long enough to slip a light in his pocket, as it had grown quite dark outside. There was no one in the dimly lighted halls. Apparently most good Tolstoians had decided to call it a night. Outside, the heavy night mist, which pinch hits for most of Venus's reign, was drifting past in streamers, condensing on everything it touched. Heidi Kupfer felt drops run down his face. Rosa said, "He's waiting at the corner of the road, and I was warned not to let myself be seen, so you had better not put on the light now." "Damn!" said Lanzarote, stumbling. "All right, Rosa, what's the story?" "We drove around most of the day looking at various views, while this Kazetsky person explained to me how beautiful it all was. It was, too. Stopped at a house where they were weaving cloth on a wooden hand-loom, and had some lunch, then drove around again. Kazetsky is not an interesting talker, as I began to realize about the 15th time he repeated his line about nature and happiness being connected. But toward dinner time he said, 'Ah, I shall take you to have a repast with a man who has in him much the spirit of the master.'" They had reached the end of the drive, and in the dark could just make out the loom of the droshky. A voice said, "Little mother?" Rosa answered, "Okay, it's me." And Heidi Kupfer flashed his light briefly to enable them to climb into the vehicle. When they were seated and the driver had stirred his horse into action with the inevitable crack of the whip, Rosa went on. "He took me a little distance, little enough so it looked as though he'd been intending to do that all along, to a house almost as big as the one we're living in, only the owner wasn't living in it. He was living in a tent pitched in a field outside by a stream. His name is Dubrasov, by the way. Kazetsky introduced me, and then went to the house and brought the family out and introduced them too, 10 or 12 of them. Dubrasov said I must bring you here at once, tonight, before it was too late, to hear something terribly important. They all said yes, I must, and then asked me whether I wanted to eat with the family or Dubrasov. Of course I said Dubrasov, and that was my big mistake. The meal consisted of a whitish liquid that tasted like turpentine and burned like it." "Kumis," said Heidi Kupfer. "It has a kick, too." "Apparently they have exceptions to their law about liquor. Anyway, I drank water. As I say, the meal consisted entirely of this kumis and meat, nothing else, and we had to eat it with our fingers. He apologized for it, I will say, and said he was taking a cure of some kind. Diet like that would cure me of wanting to live." For a moment there was silence as the droshky jounced along. Then Lanzarote's voice said out of the dark, "Evidently there are disagreements, even in happy Tolstoia, and I'm grateful for the opportunity to learn what they are, but this whole business has a rather conspiratorial odor, and I'm not sure that a diplomatic representative should be mixed up in it. If you don't mind my saying so, Rosa, you might have given us a chance to discuss all the angles before getting us out of the house." "But I couldn't do anything else, could I?" Her voice sounded hurt. The horse's feet clopped in the muddy road. Heidekopfer made a sound like the beginning of a speech, then stopped. "Beg pardon?" said Rosa. "I just wondered, why didn't you come with us to see the school today? I should have thought you'd find it interesting." "Oh, there's plenty of time. Besides, if I hadn't gone out to see the country with Kazetsky, I wouldn't have met Dubrasov." Lanzarote stirred in his place and said, "By the way, Bob, while you and Anne were looking over that farm this afternoon, I addressed myself to the matter of communications. They don't have to have any, except by word of mouth. The society is so static that there isn't anything requiring quick action by a large number of people, and they can afford to wait." "Find out anything more about the governmental system?" "They're disinclined to talk, but I gather it's an almost unchanged adaptation of the Soviet Union, which might be expected, seeing their ancestors came from there, and there's nothing in Tolstoy that would conflict with the system. As a matter of historical process, I'm a bit surprised that there should have been so little evolution." "Hell!" said Heidekopfer. "Vincent, when you get to talking theory, you're 3 parsecs over my head. I just want to know what makes things tick in a practical way." "The difference is doubtless one of the reasons why we were associated in this mission," said Lanzarote evenly, and that seemed to put a period to the conversation in the dark, until Rosa said, "This must be it. See that light in the tent?" Heidekopfer flipped on his light and set it in the catch-ring of his hat. The beam diffused through the drifting mist to catch a wooden house painted white and with shutters on quaint old-fashioned lines. It was all dark. The droshky pushed on past, bumping off the road across a field toward where a light showed dimly through the wall of a circular tent, and came to a halt. Lanzarote jumped out and handed Rosa down after him. She approached and said, "May I come in?" A deep voice boomed, "In the name of the master, enter, little mother." And the 3 went in. They saw a powerful-looking man, not as big as Samsonov, but with the same indefinable air of force, who barked, "Dubrasov, Alexei Ivanovich," and promptly sat down in the only chair in the tent. This time the ambassadors knew the right reply. They made it. Rosa sat down on the bed, the others curled up on the ground floor of the tent and waited. Dubrasov glanced from Lanzarote to Heidekopfer and back with quick motions of his head and neck thrust forward, as though he were trying to see into their minds. Finally he said, "They make me take the cure as concessionary. But it is not I who am the concessionary. It is Petrim Androvitch." "Indeed," said Lanzarote. "It is Petrim Androvitch," Dubrasov continued. "The will of all is the will of one, but he makes the will of the one the will of all." "I thought the 2 went together," said Heidekopfer. The burning eyes were fixed on him. "Are you the ambassador? It is antisocial to interrupt deliberations." Heidekopfer felt himself flush a little, but said nothing. He could hear the buzz of Rosa's recorder. "I am the ambassador," said Lanzarote smoothly, "but I am accredited to the government of Tolstoia, and so far as I am aware, you are a private citizen. However, I will be glad to hear anything you have to say that may affect the question of whether the World Council should allow Tolstoia to colonize the Rightly Islands." Petrim Androvitch wishes the world, even holy Russia. He paused and blew his nose at the name, his Adam's apple moving. Heidekopfer remembered Behrman. You shouldn't. He stopped suddenly, gagging for breath, his eyes bulging, and then closed his mouth and tried again. The achievement of universal brotherhood makes the will of all the will of one. It is possible to control the will of one for... He gagged again, his mouth open, then closed his eyes with a grimace and said, It is against the law to say more. Beware, and go in the name of the Master. End of Chapter 4.
Chapter 5 of Potemkin Village. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Potemkin Village by Fletcher Pratt. Chapter 5. The fact that Venusian trees of every species tend to trail their branches on the ground makes no particular difference. With approximately 1 day's direct sunshine during a Venusian year, shade is less important than what the tree produces and the decoration it provides. Neither, reflected Heidekopfer, would it particularly matter to people who were used to it that everything was mildly damp to the touch. The members of the Supreme Soviet scattered on the bank of the little natural amphitheater around him seemed to be having a thoroughly good time, laughing, talking, drinking beer, and listening to the music of the goose-necked instruments, which tinkled from group to group. He felt lonely, and Anne was somewhere else. There was a touch on his shoulder, and Lanzarote sat down beside him, saying in a low voice, All right, but talk fast, and smile now and then so it will look casual. I understand how you couldn't discuss it last night with Rosa in the droshky. She got angry, said Heidekopfer, just like Anne. And you think you have the explanation? You said something about pattern. It makes one mass hypnotism. Lanzarote gestured with one hand as though he were pointing to the group around them. I find that difficult to credit. The thing hasn't existed since the days of the dictators and their wars. Remember that these people are the overflow of a totalitarian state, and I don't mean mass hypnotism with one person hypnotizing many, as among the old dictators, but with the group exerting mass pressure on one person. The will of all is the will of one. Lanzarote smiled. I think you misinterpret. There is undoubtedly some pressure from what might be called public opinion, but... Listen, cried Heidekopfer desperately. It all fits together. Kazetsky twirled something bright in his fingers when he asked Rosa to spend the day with him, and all of them rallied round. They've achieved some kind of mental integration, and they want to expand. Lanzarote laid a hand on his knee. You're talking too loud, and I think on the wrong lines. The nature of this development is essentially eleemosynary. Heidekopfer experienced a sensation of being surrounded by stone walls as two of the Tolstoians stood over them. One was a member of the Supreme Soviet, whose name he had, of course, forgotten, and the other was a remarkably pretty girl with ash-blonde hair pulled back from a well-shaped forehead. He got up as the man from the Supreme Soviet said, Sonia Grigorovna is the cousin of the patriarch Petrim Androvitch. Heidekopfer. Robert Marianovich, said Heidekopfer dutifully. Lanzarote repeated his part of the formula, but the girl seemed to be concentrating on the reporter. Is it not a joy to be in this beautiful countryside? She said, looking at him directly. I find it so. Would it be your will to let me show you some of the flowers of happy Tolstoia? She said. If he were right, this was his chance to get one of them apart from the rest, where the group pressure would presumably be less effective. He said it would please me very much. She reached out a hand to take his. Come, and led the way across the bowl of green. A group of men and women stood in their path. We are going to look at flowers together, the girl announced gaily. Petrim Androvitch thinks it would be good. They all seemed to find something delightfully humorous in this, and there was a burst of laughter as they crowded round. Flowers are the nature's key to happiness, boomed one of the men, patting Heidekoffer on the shoulder. You will see what fine ones we produce in happy Tolstoia. He was suddenly aware that they were staring at him with a peculiar intensity in the midst of their animated movements, and of a slight tension, like the beginning of a headache at the back of his neck. This must be it. He was being high-pressured for some purpose. It was understandable how they would call this the Brotherhood of Man, how they had developed the ability to put mass hypnotic pressure on any individual, how the castaways had been similarly pressured into adopting the Tolstoian way of life, how... Sonia Grigorievna's voice came through his reverie. Are you dreaming, little father? Let us go. He shook himself a little like a dog coming out of water. By all means, let us go. She was really beautiful, not with the broad Slavic features at all, but a narrow face and high cheekbones that must have come from some remote Nordic ancestor. The others waved hands as she led him up the gentle slope at the edge of the bowl and pushed through a screen of trees into a field of lush grass. There was a string of bushes toward the river bank. The best flowers are there, said Sonia. Tell me, he said, when someone really does not want to do something the rest want, how do you make them do it? She gave him a glance of puzzlement. I do not understand. We do not make them do it. It is the word of the master that everything savoring of compulsion is harmful. Pretty neat, he thought. Just like the Russian Soviets of the old days who got away with dictatorship by calling it democracy. Aloud he said, I know, but don't you ever have deviationists? Oh no, the will of all is the will of one. That is the brotherhood of man. But if a person doubts whether his will is fully given, he takes the cure. That is the law. This way. She pushed through the bushes, and they were on a slope above the river, starred with red poppy-like flowers. Are they not beautiful? Let us sit here and contemplate them. The contemplation of nature is the source of happiness. Heidekoffer lowered himself to the damp grass, blessing the forethought that had led him to dress in waterproof nylon. They're very nice, he said. But when did you Tolstoians discover the brotherhood of man? She settled herself comfortably against him. I am not certain of the date, but it was in the time of the patriarch Ilarion Triumphovich, long ago. Is it your will that we cease talking of material things and address ourselves to what we see? She snuggled against him, and the pressure was not at all unendurable. He placed a hand on one of hers. Just one more question. When people come from the outside, do you always will them to stay? We do not need to. Everyone wishes to stay in happy Tolstoia. See how that blossom shakes on its stalk? Except those who come back in boxes, he thought, and wondered how he could broach the subject. But before he could think out a way, she lifted his hand beneath her own and pressed it softly against her cheek. He turned to look at her. Her lips were slightly parted as she lifted her lovely face towards his. And it struck him like a thunderbolt why the others had laughed when Sonia said they were going to see flowers at Samsonov's suggestion, and what the pressure had been on him for. He said abruptly, Do you know where Anne went? The photographer who was with us. To look at flowers with Petrim Androvitch. Her glance was neither disappointed nor hostile, merely a trifle wide-eyed, as though she had just discovered something frightening. She let his hand drop. End of chapter 5.
Chapter 6 of Potemkin Village. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Claire. Potemkin Village by Fletcher Pratt. Chapter 6. So that was the play, thought Heidkopker, a trifle grimly. The patriarch was going to make off with Anne while providing him with a substitute and putting the heat on him to accept. He scrambled up and reached a hand to Sonia Grigorevna. Let's get back to the others, if it is your will. Later, back with the others, Heidkopfer confided his ideas. If you will forgive me, says Lanzarote, I find your theory slightly fantastic. So do I, said Rosa. I haven't been conscious of any sense of pressure or the headachy feeling you mention, and I haven't done a thing I really didn't want to do. They were sitting in the ambassador's room at the Samsonov house, and it was not yet dark enough to make the candles necessary, although they were lighted. Anne wasn't there. Heidkopfer drew a long breath. The only thing I can suggest is that you have been influenced too, to some extent. Come on, look at it objectively. Won't you admit the possibility? As a matter of principle, yes, said Lanzarote. This is an island culture in the sense that it has been cut off from contact with others, and I'm well aware that island races often develop on aberrant lines. But I see no signs of the compulsions you mention. Not even Dubrazov, when he tried to warn us about something and couldn't? Lanzarote smiled. I'm afraid Dubrazov's case is a rather simple one of hallucination. It was explained to me this afternoon. They don't lock up their mental cases here. They simply let them take that cure, which amounts to a kind of shock treatment in view of their usual habits. Damn it, said Heidkopfer, but Lanzarote held up a hand. Listen, Bob, he said, I quite understand your annoyance and the reason for it. And I will say that I'm a little surprised at Anne's behavior with our friend the patriarch, but that's a purely personal matter and shouldn't be allowed to cloud the diplomatic issue, which is above personalities. And on that level I haven't encountered anything to justify your apprehensions. The evidence of pattern, you mentioned it once before. The suicides? The suicides were just suicides. I hinted at the matter, and one of them, I think it was Vikranov, came right out with the explanation without even being asked. It seems that the suicide cases among the castaways were people who had some strong tie or reason for going back, but still couldn't bear to leave Tolstoia once they got here. A simple case of a conflict they were unable to resolve. Heidkopfer got up and began to pace the floor, his brow set in a frown. Well, anyway, he said at last, I might as well tell you that I'm doing something practical about what you call my apprehensions. After what developed at the picnic, I radioed South Bergenland for a helio. It will be here tonight, and I'm going to go back on it and taking Anne with me. I advise you to come, too. Rosa Lanzarote trilled a little laugh. I don't think you'll find Anne particularly grateful or particularly willing, she said. Then, by God, I'll get help to make her willing, cried Heidkopfer. Wait, began Lanzarote, but he was already out the door and almost running down the corridor toward the apartment occupied by the Samsonovs. Not knowing what the custom was, he knocked. A female voice said, Enter, in the name of the master. Mrs. Samsonov, looking as mysterious as ever, was sitting beside a table with one of the girls who served at table, sewing on something. Good evening, Robert Murievich, she said. Petrum Andronovich is out this evening. As a matter of fact, it was you that I wanted to see, he said, and alone if possible. She glanced at the girl. Is it your will to leave at the desire of the little father? The will of one is the will of all, said the girl, picked up her sewing, and went through a door at the back as Mrs. Samsonov faced Heidkopfer. What is it you desire to say, Robert Murievich? He hesitated. Well, it's rather difficult, and I hope you won't be offended, but in happy Tolstoia we do not take offense at what nature gives us to do. That's very nice of you. Well, it's about Miss Starnes, Anne Samuelovna. She is very beautiful. That is just the trouble, I'm afraid. Did you know that she went to look at flowers with your husband this afternoon? Anna Golyevna's smile became a trifle more Mona Lisa than before, if possible. Yes, I knew it. And it doesn't worry you, not even a little bit? Not even a little bit, Robert Murievich. And he told her she should have children? It is good to have children. She smiled again at his hopeless expression and laid down her sewing. Listen, Robert Murievich, and I will tell you how it is in happy Tolstoia. We have a law that a husband and wife must remain faithful to each other, so that if Petrum Androvich looks at flowers with Anne Samuelovna, or even touches and kisses her, it is because he thinks she is beautiful, like a part of nature. Even though he is patriarch, he cannot break the law. But damn it, said Heidkopfer, I want to marry her myself. Is it her will also? The will of one must become the will of all. Heidkopfer experienced a violent sense of frustration. Look here, he said, I know you have means of influencing the way people think about things. Can't you give me a little help with Anne? She lifted one hand and placed it beside her cheek. She has achieved the brotherhood of man, and I think she will want to become a citizen of happy Tolstoia, she said. If she does, the only way would be for the Supreme Soviet to pass a law that she must marry you. Thus the will of all becomes the will of one. But I don't want to stay in Tolstoia, said Heidkopfer. Outside the door, someone shouted, In the name of the master, may I enter? Enter, called Anna Gulyevna, and the door opened on Kaznetsky. His expression looked even more morose than usual. He said to Heidkopfer, I am glad you are here, little father. Good evening, Anna Gulyevna. I am the bearer of unhappy news. Unhappiness cannot remain long in happy Tolstoia, said Anna Gulyevna gravely. What is your news, Peter Ilrich? Petrum Androvich is very desirous of the foreign woman. He has called a session of the Supreme Soviet for tonight and will propose a law that man may have 2 wives so that he can marry her. Heidkopfer saw Anna Gulyevna's hands tense in her lap, and the secret smile dropped from her face. That is most unhappy news, Pyotr Ilyich, she said. See here, said Heidkopfer, can't something be done about this? He looked at Kaczynski. You're a member of the Supreme Soviet, aren't you? Can't you oppose the bill on the ground that it's concessionary or something? But they shook their heads, looking at him gloomily. Well, by God, I'm going to do something about it if nobody else does, he said, getting to his feet. Where's this meeting being held? Kaczynski did not move. It's even worse than you think, little father. Petrum Androvich will propose a law of suicide against you. Anna Gulyevna gasped and put one hand to her mouth. Heidkopfer looked bewildered. What have I done, and what's a law of suicide? He asked. You are a resistant, said Kaczynski. It is the will of all that you fall in love with the girl Sonia Grigorievna, whom you took to look at flowers this afternoon, but it did not become your will. Therefore it is evident that you are resistant to the will of all. We always pass laws of suicide against resistants, especially if they are foreigners. It is the only way of maintaining the brotherhood of man. I see, said Heidkopfer, and he did, with a sudden, horrible clarity. So this was what had happened to the castaways, and how many others had been wiped out in these self-inflicted purges since they established their brotherhood of man. The hackles on his neck were rising, but he managed to laugh. Well, if I'm a resistant, I guess I'm not going to worry about it too much. Anna Gulyevna's face looked a trifle pale even in the candlelight. You do not know the strength of a law of suicide, she said. It makes use of the death wish, and those against whom it is passed cannot sleep until they sleep forever. Do you mean I have to take it lying down? I'm damned if I do. He took 4 quick steps across the room, tore open the door, and started down the hall. Kaczynski's voice behind him said, A moment, little father. Heidkopfer faced him. Well, what are you going to do, little father? See Lanzarote, Vincent Guidovich. He's the ambassador of the council, and he isn't going to let anything like this go on. It will do you no good. This has happened before. He has accepted the will of all, and will not believe you until the law has been passed. When the 2 new laws are passed, and the foreign woman has married Petrum Androvich, then you will commit suicide, and he will say, that is the reason he did it. You're so full of bright ideas, you just slay me, said Heidkopfer with a wry twist to his mouth. But I don't think you'd be batting them up unless you had something in mind. Come on, out with it. Kaczynski said, If you could leave Tolstoia and return where you came from before the law was passed, I do not think you would be in danger. There would be too many people around you with confused thoughts who do not belong to the brotherhood of man. And leave Anne behind to marry that old goat? No, I think not. Kaczynski said, Then there is only one thing to do. That is to go to the session of the Supreme Soviet and try to prevent the laws being passed. You are a resistant, and it is possible you could make their thinking confused enough. Heidkopfer glanced at him sharply. You want me to do it, don't you? What's your interest in this? I am a supporter of Alexei Ivanovich Dubrasov. He is a traditionalist who does not believe happy Tolstoia should be extended as Petrum Androvich wishes. If the law of suicide is not passed and you report against giving us the islands, there will be a law of suicide against Petrum Androvich, and Alexei Ivanovich will be patriarch. Heidkopfer laughed shortly. I thought there'd be some chestnut pulling connected with this somewhere. How come that the will of all the others to follow the patriarch's plan didn't affect you and Dubrasov too? The man's face went sullen. You have no right to ask me questions like that, he said. Heidkopfer reflected that the development of their mental integration had not made the Tolstoians any the less Russian. "All right, let's go," he said. "Is it far?" "At the schoolhouse. I have a droshky which I took to bring Anna Guyevna the news. It is not good to let bad news delay until the will of one becomes a resistance." "Okay, wait just a minute, will you, while I get my pocket radio? I've got some friends coming who may be some help, and I might want to get in touch with them." End of Chapter 6.
Chapter 7 of Potemkin Village. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Christine Rottger. Potemkin Village by Fletcher Pratt. Chapter 7. The lights behind the windows of the schoolhouse made vague islands in the dark pennons of mist. Cbteddy got out and tied the horse to the hitching rail as Heidkopfer dismounted. "Go in, little father," he said. "I will stay outside as long as I can." He was breathing hard, as though trying with all his strength to resist some kind of compulsion. Heidkopfer checked the sets of his radio, walked to the door, and flung it open. 15 or 20 men and women of the Supreme Soviet were seated in chairs scattered in no particular order around the classroom, with Samsonov at the teacher's desk, his back to Heidkopfer as the latter entered. But the thing that made the reporter catch his breath as the faces turned toward him like flowers toward the sun was the sight of Anne Starnes sitting just to the right of the patriarch. Her glance was coldly unfriendly. For a second or two the tableau held. Then Samsonov turned round and rose majestically to his feet. "This session of the Supreme Soviet is secret," he said, and glared. Heidkopfer once more felt the headache sensation at the back of his neck, accompanied by an almost overwhelming impulse to get out of there, to escape from that place before something dreadful happened. A strange malaise, which he could not name, possessed him. He staggered back a step, then caught Anne's eye fixed on him with the same quality as the rest, and was abruptly seized by another impulse, even more overwhelming. The second one struck him as a better idea anyway, so he yielded to it. He took 3 rapid steps toward the patriarch Samsonov, and let him have one fetched up from the region of the belt line. It took the big man flush on the button, and down he went, thrashing and kicking, as the room burst into a turmoil of shouts and chairs knocked to the floor. Anne screamed. Heidkopfer grabbed her by the arm. "You're coming with me whether you like it or not," he said in English, and turned to face the group menacingly. But nobody seemed inclined to offer him any opposition, and the thought flashed through his head that they probably had a law against physical violence, too. Samsonov had hauled himself to his feet with the aid of the desk. There was a little trickle of blood from his mouth, and his eyes were deadly. The last thing Heidkopfer heard him say as he pulled the girl through the door was, "There will be a law." Cbteddy had disappeared. Anne was limp as he bundled her into the droshky, and didn't say anything until he had unhitched the horse, climbed to the driver's seat, and with a combination of yells and jerking on the reins, urged it into plodding motion. Then she said, "Oh, Bob." He didn't turn around. "Yeah, what is it?" "I was hating you. I knew they were going to pass a law that you should commit suicide, and I was going to help them." "Nice of you." "When you hit him, something happened. It was like coming out of a dark room into the sunlight. Bob." "What is it?" "I think I need a keeper. I'll marry you when we get back, if we ever do." She began to cry. This time he swung round on the seat. "Listen, Angel," he said. "I want you just enough to take you up on that, whether it's on a rebound or not. But are you sure you're out from under the control that big lug seemed to have snapped on you? I think so, but I don't know how long it will last. Get me out of here quick. Overhead, a beam of light stabbed down through the crowding mist, just picking out the corner of Samsonov's house a few hundred yards beyond them, and there was a sound of ghostly wings. The beam shifted, ran along a line of trees, and then satisfied itself with an open field. "The Helio," said Heidecoffer. "I radioed for one on the chance I could get you away." He tried to urge the horse to greater speed as lights came on in the building, and the aircraft swung in for a landing in a pool of its own illumination. Abruptly, the headache sensation took him in the back of the neck again, stronger than ever, accompanied by an intolerable sense of depression, and the night was suddenly full of horrors ahead. It was not worth the trouble. He felt the reins loosening in his hands. "Anne," he cried, "Anne," and blacked out. He came to the sound of purring motors and struggled to sit up. Someone said, "Give him this," and a cup of coffee was held against his lips. He looked up into Anne's face. "Still feel the way you did in the droshky?" was the first thing he said as he drunk. "Shh, yes," she said, and he looked round to see the Lancerotis smiling at him across the cabin of the Helio. He struggled upright on the transom. "That was an narrow one," he said. "I think they must have passed the law of suicide against me, but I can't figure out how it would affect me so. They said I was resistant." Lanzarote said, "Thought can operate without physical presence. The Christian scientists and theosophists on Earth knew that years ago, and this was a rather massive impact." Heidecoffer shook his head. "Give me a little more of that stuff, will you? I'm still a little groggy. What I can't figure out is how you two got away and came along." "We were talking about that," said Lanzarote. "Rosa and I were just getting ready for bed when it suddenly struck us that everything you had said was true, and the Tolstoians had us under control and were showing us, in effect, a Potemkin village. When you knocked Samsonov out, even for only a moment, the control snapped on us, as it did on Anne. Then he got so interested in passing the law of suicide against you that he didn't have time to rebuild his fences. So we got away, but we had to leave most of the records." Heidecoffer drank again. "I don't suppose it makes much difference, though," he said. "Our verbal report ought to be enough to keep the council from giving them Rightly Islands. My God, if that thing got loose, with what they've developed, they'd be able to take over every inch of the 3 worlds little by little and turn them into more Tolstoias." "No," said Lanzarote emphatically. "No what?" "My recommendation will be that we grant them the Rightly Islands and any other bits of uninhabited territory they happen to want, but only for so long as Samsonov remains patriarch." Heidecoffer's mouth fell open. "What?" he exclaimed aghast. "Has he still got you under?" Lanzarote's smile was bland. "Not at all. They've attained the goal of the totalitarian state. They've got everybody thinking alike. Remember, Dombrosov couldn't warn us, even when he wanted to, although he couldn't bring himself to go along with Samsonov's expansionist policy. Samsonov showed us Potemkin villages, all right, but don't you see what all this crazy setup adds up to? These people can't change. They've lost their adaptability. The system has got to be rigid because the first time anyone expresses an individual idea, the whole totalitarian structure will collapse. They're inbred and interlocked, and Samsonov has complete control of their thinking and their behavior, for the time being at least. But as soon as the Tolstoians expand to Rightly Islands or anywhere else, They'll be facing conditions they've never before encountered. They'll have to learn to think for themselves again. And as soon as they start to think new thoughts, Samsonov's power will evaporate. He'll lose his grip just like he did on me," finished Heidekoffer, reaching for Anne's hand. "You see," concluded Lanzarote, "Dombrasov was the really dangerous one. He didn't have new ideas, and whether they were castaways or not, more people would have been drawn in on him." The little group was quiet, contemplative. Then they smiled knowingly at one another. "Let's go home," said Anne, "and make my last picture." End of chapter 7. End of Potemkin Village by Fletcher Pratt.